Men's Minute modcast with his mates, Sadia, RT, and Caro. Episode 166.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Min's Minute modcast with his mates. We're going to have a fascinating topic on something I'm starting to learn about, which excites me and scares me at the same time. Probably more scares me than anything else. And it's on the back of recently having Arti on my one-to-one modcast recently on the topic of deep fakes. Arti, let's start off with what's been happening this week in the world of deep fakes. You kindly told me about one of the cases that we had last year with Arab and the $25 million fraud they had with the finance director. What else has been in the news recently?
So this week we're actually looking at deepfake use in warfare. The world around us is burning, right? Everywhere, every continent has some form of war going on. And more recently, the news that's coming out of Asia with the conflict that took place over there last week, earlier this week, we've seen heavy use of disinformation, misinformation, with a view to controlling the narrative by the nations engaged in this conflict, and a heavy use of deepfake technology in the form of voice clones, in the form of manipulated videos, images, etc. So we're seeing that. And actually, my conversation with the defense forces, whom I train on a regular basis, kind of transpires that actually this is a deliberate warfare tactic for defense agencies around the world. So psychological warfare is part of the conflict strategy now, not just boots on the ground or in air and sea. It's the psychological warfare. And unfortunately, deepfake plays very well in that, because you are in a stressful environment, your emotions are heightened, your situational vulnerabilities are very much exposed. And in that, when you're using a very believable technology which clones voices or creates realistic videos, then the psychological manipulation becomes easy, and it leads to control of narrative and other forms of tactics which defense forces are using. So I had not connected the dots about this before, and I was quite surprised how it is being utilized. And in fact, there are active projects in play with some of the defense forces around the world who are developing better and better cloning and impersonation technologies, as well as detection technologies. So yeah, that was my sort of key takeaway of the week.
Now, Satya, obviously based in India as well. Have you seen any of these deep fakes about the recent conflict?
I do now wonder what is the original or the deepfake that I have seen. I tend to follow independent journalists because what happens in the news world is you just don't know what version they want you to hear. So that becomes very difficult for me to follow any news which is broadcasted, no matter from which country or which part of the world. I would see what independent journalists who have nothing to do with this, or I still think I do not know if they are the deepfakes who are giving me news, right? Like, it's such a paradoxical thing that I just don't know if what I'm listening is true or not.
Yeah, I've done a bit of digging in this space, actually, not disseminating deepfakes, I have to say. And it is really interesting. I was talking on the radio just the other day, and we were talking about copyright, but we very quickly got into the area of deepfakes because they're quite linked, actually, and attempts to manage the copyright issue is partly about stopping people imitating how others appear. It doesn't surprise me that it's being used as an active tool of war. It's certainly been used a lot as a pre-war tool, if you like, as a propaganda tool, but also as a way of influencing elections. And even Moldova's EU referendum, Russia was using deepfake and fake news. Well, that was more of a leafleting campaign, but we've seen time and again Argentina's election very much used a lot of deep fakes on either side. And even the US election, the New Hampshire primary last year had a cloned voice alleging to be President Biden, telling people not to vote. Save your vote for the main election. Don't come out to vote in our primaries. So it's a precursor to all, but it doesn't surprise me that it's been used in the war environment, because you have to make decisions very quickly and you have to depend on a chain of command. So you don't necessarily have all the time to put those checks and double checks in place, because decisions have got to be made fast, and you absolutely have to depend on the instructions that you're being given from that chain of command, the hierarchy. It's why things like the Signalgate issues with security at the Pentagon and at the US administration become more concerning, that security of comms and security of these decisions isn't maybe taken as seriously as it might be. So it doesn't surprise me that it's being used in that manner. But it's a really tricky one to challenge, actually. So there's lots of regulatory action going on and we can talk about, and there's lots of different ways to tackle it. It often comes down to, in the civilian space, it comes down to kind of the intention of what people are using it for, but also whether it's being done for commercial gain, whether it's being done maliciously, whether it's to do with elections or to do with sometimes sexually explicit content, or is actually done for fraud. And it's the old debate between free speech and moderation of content and security that it comes down to, I think. So there are lots of efforts going on to regulate this, and we can talk about some of the tools and some of their limitations that can try to detect deepfakes. It's a very tricky one. That's insightful, isn't it? It's a very tricky one. That's my level of insight today.
Whilst I remember what you were just saying about copywriting laws and what's going on in the US, I saw President Trump's just fired his head of copyright because he was basically saying, no, we can't just take all of this information and use it for the AI. So yeah.
Yeah, very concerning for two reasons. One, so the US Copyright Office had just come out with a strong opinion, a really well written, I thoroughly recommend it to people, detailed opinion saying that using copyrighted material to train AI models is not fair use. It's obviously much more detailed and nuanced, but essentially that's what it was saying. Isn't fair use. You've got to pay people, and if not, this is infringement. And there are many lawsuits going on in the US on exactly this topic, most famously the New York Times against OpenAI, but many others are looking at this issue. And yeah, the next day, the head of that agency is dismissed by President Trump. So worrying not only for the law, but also for the political environment and the legal system in the US, really. But it's a debate we're having again in the UK. We've just had an amendment letter signed by 400 artists, including Elton John, protesting this again. Many protests have gone on, and the UK is looking at this again because we had proposed legislating to make it fair use and to allow it to happen to help the AI industry, and jumped up and said, hang on, we're worth far more to you than the tech sector here. Come on, we need some protection. So debate's raging again here, but it's kind of linked to deepfakes because it's part of that narrative of, can you write me a song in the style of so-and-so? Can you write me a script in the style of so-and-so? So there is a link there, I think, between the two of them.
I had to go with using one of those music generators. You'd have told me off, Caro, for doing that. Sorry about that. And I said do it in the style of the Beatles, and thankfully it said, no, we can't do it in a particular, you can't mention a particular person.
That's really interesting, because I think that's one of the easier ways actually to regulate this is to come in at that point and say, well, even if you've trained your model on this, people then can't do a direct copyright infringement impersonation of it. And it's not a model that seems to have been proposed. It's not what the UK is looking at doing in its consultation on copyright. The EU has some bits of that in its generative AI code of practice, but doesn't go so far as to mandate certain prompts and things being banned. So that's interesting that the model did that. Well, welcome to that company. Very responsible.